Well, good afternoon, everyone. It really is good to be here with you and have a full house. And I wish we could have that every Sabbath. Greetings to all you folks out there who'll be listening to this and watching it a little later on. I want to ask a question. Is there any correlation in the Bible between what happened thousands of years ago and what's happening now, today? Most people tend to think that the biblical account of certain events are just fables. They'll talk about Jonah and the whale and other stories that they may tell their children. But it's just something that they read about, something that they may not think is real. They see no correlation between events that occurred 2,000 to 3,000 years ago. They cannot connect the dots. Can we? Can we connect some of the dots at least? In this modern age, the Bible and God has actually become irrelevant. In fact, the scriptures say that the time will come when they will actually forget my name, God says. They won't even know who He is. And I think we're there. So many people now, they don't know who God is. They don't have any idea who He is, what He stands for, what He represents, what's His message. They don't know. Most people today pretty much do as they please. That's the way they like it. It's more convenient. They don't want anybody or anything telling them what to do. I want to do it my way. And most people do. There is actually no moral code to live by today. At one time there was in this country. They even taught the Bible in schools. That's one of the reasons they had schools, so that children can learn how to read and read the Bible, so they know how to live, conduct their lives. But that's no more. Because now, because of our freedoms, we can't use this book without offending someone else and the book they use. So we don't use it at all. They cannot connect the scenario that took place in the Garden of Eden with the conditions extant in the world today. Can we? Do we realize what that little simple thing of Eve eating, they say an apple, but we don't know what it was. It was a fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and she chose to eat that fruit. That's a nice little story, isn't it? The children like that. They'll remember. They even talk about Adam's apple in your throat. And the little children go to bed with their little bedtime prayers. Now lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Well, at least they're praying something. That's my prayer. I prayed up until I was in college. Boy, I really got connected to God. But anyway, is it just in case something happened during the night? I wanted to make sure that my soul was taken care of. But when you look at what's going on today, we realize that the eating of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil went against God, was contrary to God's teaching. And so therefore He took the Holy Spirit and access to spiritual knowledge. And everybody started doing what was right in their own eyes. And what's that got us? Look at us today. Look at the world. Everybody's got an opinion. And everybody thinks their opinion is right. And if you don't agree with their opinion, then we'll protest. We'll file a lawsuit. Because I'm right, and you've got to be the way I am. Or else you're wrong. That's just one scenario. And that happened thousands of years ago. But the impact upon that decision has affected all of mankind and brought us to where we are today. And will actually bring us to the brink of utter destruction unless God intervenes on behalf of the elect. Though many admit America and Britain's exceptionalism, and how can you not admit the fact that we were a great nation and still are to a degree, but they cannot connect the dots to Genesis 12, where God told Abraham in a covenant, in a promise, I will make of you, Abraham, a great nation, and from you all the nations of the earth will be blessed. They can't grasp the concept that there were 12 sons from Jacob, that those 12 tribes grew into nations, and they spread out. Where are they? They don't know. They think that that little nation over there they call Israel is Israel. But that's only Judah. But they can't connect the dots. They don't realize why we possess the sea gates of our enemies. Why we had Canada in the north and Mexico in the south and two great oceans on each side to protect us. And why we did have the sea gates. Panama Canal, Suez Canal, Strait of Gibraltar. We owned all of those at one time. Of course, in our ignorance, we gave it back. Then that was to protect us, to make us great. But they can't connect the dots. No significance whatsoever. They still don't know who America is. And probably won't. It's evident because when, who is it? Who was the monarchy that married recently? I can't think of his name, but the whole world was fascinated. They wanted a picture of that baby. And now I think she's going to have a second one. The world is fascinated with the monarchy. Why do we have a monarchy in Britain? Why does it even exist? Is there anything related in the Bible to that? Of course there is. God made a covenant with David. He says, you will always have someone sitting on that throne. And even when Solomon did what he did, God worked it out so that they kept a descendant. The stone of scone. Jacob's pillar stone. Why did the kings and queens of England, why are they coronated on that stone? They don't know. And even if they do write stories about it, they can't relate it to biblical information and knowledge. They just can't do it. Well, there's a lot of other situations we could talk about. But the world that you and I are living in today, we're in trouble as far as what's going on around the world. And of course we talk about it, as Mr. Taylor mentioned yesterday. Our news commentators will get together and I think the expression they use, we need to have a conversation about racism in America. Yeah, we need to talk about it, we really do. But there's not a thing they're going to be able to do about it because there's nothing changing the hearts and minds of man. A racist will probably remain a racist, and it's going to get even worse. But there are events that are taking place in our world today that we need to be aware of. Now, I don't know that there's much we can do about it except prepare for the ultimate event that's going to take place. As Mr. Smith mentioned, we're getting to the point now where I think we probably thought we were back in the 50s. But time has passed, and here we are now, 2015, and a lot of things have taken place. A lot of conditions have changed. And what's happening in our government? Nobody's going to do anything about it, but we are being fundamentally transformed as a nation. And we can't stop it because nobody has any courage to do anything about it. So we just kind of, instead of going up the stream, flow along downstream. It's easier that way. Besides, if I do anything about it, I may not get reelected. So we'll just stand up and talk about what we're going to do, but when you elect me, I'm not going to do anything because I don't have the guts. I don't have the courage. That's our leadership today. Leadership in Washington, D.C. I want to show you an event that took place way back in the book of Genesis today and how it correlates with the world you and I are living in today. It's a fascinating subject. I'm fascinated by it. So I'm going to take you back several thousand years and show you how it has affected us through history, actually, all the way up to where we are right now and how it's going to affect us in the future. So let's go back to Genesis 36. Genesis 36. And begin reading in verse 1. Now I'm going to read these so you'll get the background of what we're talking about. Genesis 36, verse 1. Now these are the generations of Esau. Now who was Esau? It says he's Edom, but Esau took his wives of the daughters of Canaan, and he was one of Isaac's sons. Isaac had Jacob and Esau. So Esau was his son, and he is Edom, it says. And it tells that they took his daughters, they married from the Gentile nations around them, not within the family. Now going on over to verse 8, thus dwelt Esau in Mount Seir. Esau is Edom. We've come to understand that Edom is Turkey. And these are the generations of Esau, the father of the Edomites, in Mount Seir. Now, Mount Seir is south of the Salt Sea. These are the names of Esau's sons. Eliphaz, the son of Adah, the wife of Esau. Reuel, the son of Bashemath, the wife of Esau. And the sons of Eliphaz were Teman, Omar, Zepho, and Gatham, and Kenaz. Now, verse 12. And Timnah was concubine to Eliphaz, Esau's son, and she bare to Eliphaz Amalek. Now there is a grandson of Esau, and his name was Amalek. So we see that he was going to grow just as all these other sons into nations, and the families would expand. So we're going to focus in on Amalek. Going back to Exodus 17. Verse 8. Now leading up to that, while you're turning there, God had delivered the children of Israel out of Egypt. They had come to Rephidim in verse 1, and all the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of Sin after their journeys according to the commandment of the Lord, and pitched in Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. Well, here's the situation where they started complaining to Moses, and God had to provide them with water. Now, after that little incident took place, notice what it says in verse 8. Then, after that, came Amalek. He's a descendant of what we just read about, Esau's grandson. And Moses said to Joshua, choose us out men and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. God told him, says, you stand up there, hold up your arms, hold that rod up, and pray. And he did that. So Joshua did as Moses had said to him and fought with Amalek, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Well, Moses, every time he got tired and dropped his arms, then the Amalekites started winning. And finally he said, I can't hold my arms up anymore. I need some help. So Aaron and Hur went up. They brought a rock up, set him down on a rock, and held his arms up. And ultimately, after a long day's struggle, then they had pushed the Amalekites back. And it came to pass when Moses held up his hand, as we said, that they won the battle. Now, going down to verse 14, and the Lord said to Moses, write this for a memorial in the book. I was wondering if we might, Susan, cut that down just a little bit. It's really getting warm in here. And the Lord said unto Moses, write this for a memorial in the book, and rehearse it in the ears of Joshua. Now we know that Moses could write. He was prolific, and God would inspire him to write at least the first 5 books of the Bible. That's known as the Torah. For he says, I will utterly put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and called the name of it Jehovah Nissi. For he said, because the Lord has sworn that the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. Now what's that tell you? Does that have any impact on us today? Or was that just during the biblical times? Maybe just during Moses' time? No, he said from generation to generation to generation, Amalek's going to be there and you're going to have to fight them. Well, why? What was so bad about those Amalekites? Well, let's go to Deuteronomy 25. Deuteronomy 25 and see what they did. Deuteronomy 25, verse 17. Verse 17. Remember what Amalek did unto you by the way when you were come forth out of Egypt. So now he's saying, you write this down, don't you forget it. You remember what happened. And now he explains what they did. How he met you by the way, and he smote the hindmost part of you. As they moved out, and there were several million of them, and they had the weak and the sick and the children and the women in the rear. and the soldiers and so forth were in the front. And I guess they were expecting an onslaught from the front. But no, not Amalek. He hid in the rocks. And after the strong men passed, here they came and attacked the men, women, and children that were weak. Even all that were feeble behind you, when you were faint and weary. Now notice what it says, and he feared not God. Now I didn't say that he didn't know God. How could you have lived in that day and all the things happened back in Egypt when God destroyed the most powerful nation on earth? You think they didn't know about it in those areas? Well, I'm sure they did. So they knew that this God of Israel was a powerful God. They weren't afraid of him. They didn't fear him at all. They were attacking his chosen people, as Amalekites were. Verse 19, therefore it shall be, when the Lord your God has given you rest from all your enemies round about in the land which the Lord your God gives you, for an inheritance to possess it, that you shall blot out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven. You shall not forget it. And when the Israelites went into battle many times, the war cry was, remember the Amalekites, because they were a ruthless group of people who would attack the weak and the lame and children and women. That's the type of people they were. Had no compassion, no mercy whatsoever. They didn't mind beheading someone, didn't mind killing them, didn't mind hurting them in any way. Now, this continued on after they got into the promised land. Let's go to Judges, the 3rd chapter. In Judges, the 3rd chapter, verse 12. Judges 3, verse 12. Now, after they got into promised land, sometimes I look back and I read the children of Israel and I ask myself, how in the world could they have seen all the things that they saw, and how God had worked miracles in their life, gave them water from a rock, manna from heaven, protected them? How could they have not obeyed him? And yet they didn't have God's Holy Spirit, so without it, you can't do it. So as soon as they got out there and they started mingling with the Gentile nations around them, then they began to reject God. And that's what happened here. And when they did, there was always a penalty for breaking God's laws. And here's what happens. Verse 12, and the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord. And the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel, because they had done evil in the sight of the Lord. You know, God uses these Gentile nations. He can use them to punish us. He has been with us in the First World War. He's been with us in the Second World War. But will he be with us in the Third World War? As we begin to reject God and do things that are right in our own eyes, when we see the crime and evil and immorality is taking place in our country, in the next war, and it's inevitable that it will take place, will God get us through it? Well, the Bible says no. But in this case, he's going to punish the Israelites. And he gathered unto him the children of Ammon and Amalek, and went and smote Israel and possessed the city of palm trees. So here we see Amalek united with some of these other nations. Now, where are we talking about? We're talking about the Middle East, aren't we? We're talking about in and around Israel, around the Mediterranean Sea, and those nations that are around there. That's what we're talking about. Nations today occupied primarily by Muslims and Arabs. That's who occupies that territory today, and they did then. And Israel was always having to fight them. Let's go to Judges 6. Continuing on, this is when the judges were looking over Israel. In Judges 6, verse 1, and the children of Israel did evil again in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of Midian 7 years. And the hand of Midian prevailed against Israel, and because of the Midianites, the children of Israel made them the dens which are in the mountains and caves and strongholds. They had to go into hiding in the rocks, in the cliffs, afraid of the terrorists, afraid they were going to kill them, afraid they were going to take their children captive or kill the women. They lived in terror. because they were disobeying God. And so it was when Israel had sown that the Midianites came up, and the Amalekites, once again, and the children of the east, even they came up against them. So here's those old, nasty, mean Amalekites again, giving Israel fits. Well, we continued on, and then the children of Israel, after the judges, they were not satisfied with the government. And they said, look, why can we not have a king like all these other nations around us? So we go to the book of Samuel. They were asking for a king, and God told Samuel, he said, give them what they want. He said, all they'll do is take your people, put them in the army, said they'll tax you to death. He says, it's going to be a difficult time, but go ahead and give them what they want. So Saul was the first king. And so we come to 1 Samuel 15, and after God appointed Saul as the king, he had an assignment for him. Just as he would any king or any commander, he said, I want you to do something. So 1 Samuel 15, verse 1, Samuel also said unto Saul, the Lord sent me to anoint you to be king over his people, over Israel. Now therefore hearken you unto the voice of the words of the Lord. So he told him to do something in verse 2. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I remember that which Amalek did to Israel. We've already read what he did. He attacked the hindmost part of the Israelites when they came out, and they continued to attack them through the years. How he laid wait for him in the way when he came up from Egypt. Now go and smite Amalek and utterly destroy all. Now I didn't understand why God would want to destroy all, because he says here, I want you to slay man, woman, infant, suckling, ox, sheep, everything. Just blot out all that the Amalekites have. Get rid of all of them. Until I saw films of some of those Muslim fighters of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, where they were little kids running around. And recently they had one, it was a very young child, beheaded someone. So once you get that embedded in the minds of a child, you're not going to get it out. And so you have to destroy them. That's the only way you can get rid of it. So God said, do it. And he gave that order to Saul. And Saul gathered all the people together. And he numbered them in Telem, 200,000 footmen and 10,000 men of Judah. He had a huge army. And Saul came to a city of Amalek and laid wait in the valley. Now Saul said unto the Kenites, another Gentile nation, go depart, get you down from among the Amalekites, lest I destroy you with them, for you showed kindness to all the children. So he wasn't going to destroy them, but he was going to destroy the Amalekites. Verse 7, and Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah until you come to Shur, that is over against Egypt. And he took Agag. Now Agag was the king of the Amalekites, and he took him alive and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. Now what did God tell him to do? He said, destroy all of them. But Saul took the king alive for some reason. And then they began to sort out the sheep, the cattle, and all the spoil that they were getting, and they kept the good stuff for themselves, and they destroyed the bad. Well, the rest of the story goes that Samuel came up, and he heard the bleating of the cattle and the sheep, and he said, what's that noise I hear? Oh, and he started rationalizing. We kept that. We kept that to sacrifice to God. And Samuel says, that's not what you were told to do. You were told to destroy all of them. So as a result of that, what happened? Saul lost his kingship. God took it away, gave it to David. But Samuel went on, and he did kill Agag, who was the king. Now, note this. Many times a nation will take the name of the king. So here was Agag, so anyone that followed him was called Agites or Agagites. And we'll see how that fits in just a moment. So apparently, during this period of time, some escaped. They didn't kill them all. Even though he killed Agag later on, some of them still had to escape because they turn up generations later. You can't get rid of them. It's like roaches. You know, the roaches run everywhere. You cut the light on and they just run under everything. My wife and I had a battle with roaches one time. We rented this house and we came down at one night in the middle of the night. We cut the light on and those things were everywhere. On the sink, in the cabinets. Man, we started throwing pots and pans and started chasing them down, hit them with their shoes and papers and fly swats and went off and bought stuff at the store. And I think by the time we finally left the place, we got rid of most of the roaches. But I'm sure there was one little rascal, male and female probably, that got away, and they probably turned up in another house somewhere. And that's the way the Amalekites were. Filthy, rotten, things that you just couldn't get rid of. So, let's go to Chronicles, 1 Chronicles 4. As time passed, time is passing on. We're moving through centuries. 1 Chronicles 4. Notice verse 1. Now, this is listing here, and I can't stand to read the Bible where you got all these genealogies. I just can't get into it. I'll read a couple of them and I'm lost. So, the reason I'm telling you this is so we know what we're talking about. 1 Chronicles 4 verse 1, the sons of Judah. So, he goes on and he begins to list the sons of Judah. And he goes on down through paragraph after paragraph after paragraph. Then he comes down to verse 38. These mentioned by their names were princes in their families, and the house of their fathers increased greatly. You see how it works? Here's a man and a woman, and they get married. It's like Adam and Eve. They had children, and their children had children, and look at what we got today, 7 billion people. And that's even after the bunches of them were killed in the flood. So you see how it can progress through the years, through the generations. And that's what's happening with these children, these families. They're going to grow into nations. Where do you think the nations we got come from today? Well, they had to come from Adam and Eve, so they had to multiply and reproduce, like God told them to do. So he said they grew greatly. Now verse 42. And some of them, even the sons of Simeon, 500 men, went to Mount Seir. Well, Mount Seir, isn't that where Edom was? Sure. That's what we read about. That's Esau's descendants. They went to Mount Seir having for their captains, and it lists the captains here, and verse 43, they smote the rest of the Amalekites that were escaped and dwelt there unto this day. So here's the Amalekites again, showing up in the conflicts with Israel. Now, it said they smote the rest of them. But history proves that they didn't get them all. There was one roach that got away. That one little Amalekite roach. And he slithered off somewhere, and probably several others, and they began to reproduce again. Going on over to the book of Esther. You're familiar with the book of Esther. Now, do you know your history? You see, a lot of people don't want to study history, but they don't realize that history has an impact because it's going to repeat itself. Now, if you remember, the Assyrians was a world-ruling empire at that time, and they were the ones that took the northern 10 tribes captive, but they left Judah. And they had disseminated them throughout the nations. That was 721 B.C. Now, following Assyria, another world-ruling empire emerged, Babylon, with Nebuchadnezzar. And these lasted several hundred years. They progressed over time. And we read in the Bible that there were that beast had 7 heads. Babylon was one of them. Now, following Babylon was the Medes and the Persians, the Persian Empire. Now, the Persian Empire is modern-day Iran. You ever hear that mentioned? Well, we're over there negotiating with them, aren't we? The modern-day Persians. But in this particular case, the Persians had defeated the Babylonians. And the king, as we read in verse 1, it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, and I think that's Xerxes, was the king of Persia, world-ruling empire. And he was celebrating. I'll just kind of summarize as we go through here what's taking place. He was celebrating what was taking place, his victories. And he had a wife named Vashti. Must have been a beautiful woman, and he was having this drunken party, and it went on for days and days and days. Finally, he called for her to come in. He wanted her to do some dancing. Now, what I understand is he probably wanted her to come in and dance nude before all those men, and she refused. So I'm not going to do it. Well, as a result of that, he says, well, you're out of here, lady, because he's king. You're supposed to do what the king says. So he got rid of her, and then later on they brought up to him, his court brought up to him, told him what he had done. So he said, well, get me some more women. Go out and look through all the kingdom. Bring all the beautiful women in here and get them prepared to come before me. So they did, and it just happened to be that there were some Jewish women there. Now remember, the Babylonians were the ones who took Judah captive about 100 years after the Assyrians took the northern 10 tribes. Remember that, around 606 BC? The Babylonians took the southern tribe of Judah and Benjamin captive and held them there. And so when the Medes and the Persians defeated the Babylonians, they still had Jewish captives there. And so we pick up the story here in Esther 2, and let's see where I want to start. Verse 5, I guess. It says, now in Shushan, the palace, there was a certain Jew. Well, he was a slave at that time, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish. He was a Benjamite. So he came from one of the southern tribes, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity, which had been carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. So they took these captives, these slaves away. And he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, that was her other name, his uncle's daughter. For she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful. Now whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, he took her for his own daughter. So he took her to raise, this beautiful woman of Esther. So it came to pass when the king's commandment and his decree was heard, and when many maidens were gathered together under Shushan, the palace, to the custody of Hegai, that Esther was brought up also unto the king's house, to the custody of Hegai, keeper of the women. So I imagine that these women today that have that have these products for beauty, they would have probably envied the things that these women went through, because they would bring them in and they would, whatever they used, milk or whatever they did to soften the skin and beautify their hair and the makeup and all of that, they just went through a whole rigmarole before they went before the king. So Esther was brought in, and she was going to have to be prepared like that. And it says the maiden pleased him, and she obtained kindness of him, and he speedily gave her things for purification, with such things as belonged to her, and 7 maidens which were meet to be given her out of the king's house. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. So he liked her, and he gave her favor. Now Esther had not showed her people nor her kindred. They did not know that she was a Jew. Had she been a Jew, she may have never made it that far. But Mordecai had charged her that she should not show it. Sometimes it's best if we keep our mouth shut. Don't put your business on the street, I used to say, because sometimes you do, and you can get yourself in trouble. So she kept her mouth shut. So they didn't know that she was a Jew. So this Mordecai, as we go over to Esther, the 3rd chapter, in verse 1, is going to run into trouble. In chapter 3, verse 1, after these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. What was the king's name that Saul was supposed to have killed? Agag. So what were the followers of Agag called? Agagites. Here, several hundred years later, these roaches are still extant, still alive, still causing problems. Now, here's Persia. And here is this Haman, who had worked his way up through the system and had a very prestigious position in that government. He was very influential with the king. Now, once he was promoted, as we heard yesterday in the last day of unleavened bread, about how pride can ruin you. Well, it got to him. His head was so swelled up that I believe he may have thought he was king. And he was so filled with pride, and he wanted everybody to know it. That's the way pride does. You can't keep it to yourself. You just got to tell it. And if nobody will brag on you, you brag on yourself. So this old guy, this Agagite, Haman, in verse 2, and all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did in reverence. Why do you think Mordecai wouldn't? Because it says, thou shalt have no other gods before me. You shall not make unto thee any graven images. I will not bow down to a man, he said, because he was Jewish. And he knew that, and he wouldn't do it. Well, the king's servants, which were in the king's gate, said to Mordecai, why transgressest thou the king's commandment? He said, what's wrong with you? Why are you not doing what he says? Don't you know he's going to get angry? Don't you know he's going to get you? Well, it came to pass, when they spoke daily unto him, and he hearkened not unto them, that they told Haman, to see whether Mordecai's matters would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. It got out. And he went to Haman, and they told him, this guy that won't bow down before you is a Jew. A Jew? And when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence, then was Haman full of wrath. He was angry, filled with hate. I'll fix him, he says. And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for they had showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman, he didn't want to just get rid of Mordecai. He sought to destroy all the Jews. It's in them. It's in those Amalekites. They can't help themselves. They hate the Jews with a passion, and they want to destroy them from generation to generation to generation. They will not go away. So here he is showing up in the days of Esther. And he sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. Verse 8, and Haman said unto King Ahasuerus, there is certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom, and their laws, Jewish laws, that's what he's referring to, are different from all your people. Neither keep they the king's laws. That's a lie. I'm sure they obeyed the laws that they could within the land. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to allow them to live. Well, the king doesn't. I mean, he's got people everywhere. He's got all nationalities. But here's a man he just promoted, a man he respects. Surely he's going to look out for my back. Surely he's going to help me. If it please the king, let it be written. He says, I need an order from you, sir, that they may be destroyed. And I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have the charge of the business to bring it to the king's treasuries. This guy had some money, and he was willing to pay to get them destroyed. That's how much he hated them. And the king took his ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the Jews' enemy. And you know the rest of the story. Mordecai went to Esther, and he said, listen, Esther, he's going to kill us all. And he says, don't think you're going to get out of it either, young lady, because once they find out you're a Jew, you'll die too. Well, she agonized over it. What do I do? She's put it, to go in before the king without an invite. If he didn't accept you, if he didn't acknowledge you, you'd be killed. But he says, you got to do it. So the word went out amongst all the Jews. They prayed and they fasted. And they sought God. And God, from his majestic throne in heaven, looked down and he heard. He heard the cry. Because they're his people. And we know that he'll never leave them or forsake them. So he responded to their repentance, responded to their prayers, responded to the fasting. So Esther went in before the king. And went in before the door and he looked up. And she was wondering, will he accept me? Will he not? And he motioned, come on in. So when she went in and she told him the story, she said, there's one man that's going to try to destroy my people. Who is it, he said. Well, it's an interesting scenario about how Esther had invited Haman up for dinner and brought him up, and Haman thought that he was going to be rewarded for all of his service. And during the course of the evening, somehow, Haman tripped and fell, and he fell on the couch or the bed with Esther, and the king came in. And he was flabbergasted that this man would come into his own house and try to make out with his wife. Well, Haman had been building this gallows to hang Mordecai the Jew, and the king says, take him and hang him on those gallows. And so God saved the nation of Israel from the Amalekites. And that's why they observe the holiday of Purim today, because God intervened on their behalf. Now, I have an article I was looking up on the internet, and this is from a fellow named David Sidman, and he's no doubt a Jewish writer, and he writes, Amalek is a nation of people who despise God, and in an effort to erase God from human consciousness, actively conspires to kill off his chosen people, the Jews. Well, that's well known among the Jewish nation. The Torah also teaches us that Amalekites exist in every generation. We heard that we were going to have to battle them from generation to generation to generation. Here we are today. This was written in 2014. Even today, there's a direct commandment from God to the Jewish people to destroy and kill Amalek, which means that in every generation Amalek exists. But who is Amalek? Who are the Amalekites? And that's the name of this sermon. Who are the Amalekites? Where are they today? How do you identify them? How do you know? We just know they're there. Those little dirty roaches are still slithering around in the darkness and doing their dastardly deeds. This is a constant dilemma facing observant Jews as to whether or not we are able to identify that evil nation of Amalek. Surely radical Muslims like Hamas and ISIS fit the profile of those who would cut off the weak links of the Jewish people while they are tired and exhausted. That's the way they do. They attack homes. They go into the marketplaces where the men and women and the children are shopping, and they blow them up. They slip into their homes. Recently, there was one that slipped in, killed a mother, and slit the throat of a baby 3-year-old child. That's the way they operate, these type of people. They're evil. They have no conscience whatsoever. That is precisely what they have been doing throughout this summer's war in Gaza. And pretty much ever since the state of Israel came into existence. They're constantly having to fight the Amalekites and other Gentile nations as well. But they are both monotheists, and Arabs, making them descendants of Ishmael. The Arabs are descendants of Ishmael, remember, and the Amalekites are descendants of Esau. This is also why there is a general consensus in the Jewish world that the Nazis were in fact Amalek. Remember when Assyria, who is Germany, took the northern 10 tribes? They took the people that were in that territory at that time, took them captive into their nations. Many of them never went back. So there's a theory, and it certainly fits the profile of the Nazis during World War II, who destroyed 6-7 million Jewish people without any compassion whatsoever. No mercy. So that's one theory. They fit the Amalek profile like a glove. They're Europeans, which means they are descendants of Esau, which Amalek is. They were agnostics who want to kill every last Jew. It doesn't get more obvious than that, he says. Now, a possible Amalek nation are the Iranians. Remember, Iran is modern-day Persia. Persia is where Esther was living. That's the king that was in charge during that time. And we know that Haman was there, and there had to be other Amalekites there as well. And just destroying Haman didn't get rid of the Amalekites. Do you think they all moved out of Persia and are no longer there, extant in the world today? I'm sure they continue to live on. So I find it ironic that the United States of America is negotiating with a nation that says we want to destroy Israel and wipe them off the face of the earth, and the great Satan in America as well. Like the Turks, they are not Arabs, making them descendants of Esau. And it's well known, as we mentioned, that Haman was an Amalekite and was situated in Persia, modern-day Iran. Which brings us back to a previous question. Can we consider the Muslims Amalek, even though they believe in God? It said they feared him, didn't say they didn't believe in him. They just didn't fear God, especially when they are obsessed with dominating and killing God's chosen people or anyone who worships God in a different language or building than they do. What's happening in the world today in the Middle East among ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Boko Haram? They're killing Christians. That's their objective and their goal. Followers, allegedly, of Christ. Although the Muslims clearly believe in God, their actions demonstrate belief in a God whose decrees are the polar opposite of ours. They believe in, Muhammad as the prophet, and Allah. And they cry Allah when they kill people and destroy them. So it's certainly not the God we worship who says, thou shalt not kill. Furthermore, if we look closely at the passage in the Scriptures, it says they did not fear God. And they don't. How could you do what they're doing and believe that there is a God and not fear Him? You can't. They do it without conscience. It doesn't say that Amalekites, by definition, don't believe in God, just that they don't fear Him. It's hard to imagine that a community whose doctrine preaches executing other fellow monotheists, other members of the Arab nations that have turned to Christians, in cold blood is a religion that fears God. It's becoming more and more apparent to Israeli Jews that the Muslims don't fear much at all, except for anything that is both violent and stronger than they are. They don't fear us now because we're giving in to them. We're afraid we're going to offend someone. So we just acquiesce. We back off and let them grow and grow. And it's true that once they move into a nation and they grow in number, they begin to insert themselves, begin to request Sharia law. I understand there is Sharia law being implemented even down in Texas now among some of the Muslim people. So the stronger they get, the more they push for their religion and their laws. And we're allowing them to come in the country all the time. And the same is happening throughout Europe and Asia. They're growing in great numbers. Then there's the Talmud, which is the Jewish oral law, which argues that the aggression and ethnic cleansing of Sennacherib, the king of Assyria and destroyer of Samaria, mixed up the nations, and that's what I meant earlier. They took maybe some of the Amalekites up into Europe. Although it's possible that one of several individual nations might be Amalek, it's also possible that the Amalekites are scattered throughout various nations across the globe. How do they look? I don't know. Can you tell what a murderer looks like? I used to have people in the prison that had committed murder, and someone would come up that said, they don't look like a murderer. I said, well, how does a murderer look? I've seen some of the most sophisticated people, handsome men, and beautiful women that are murderers. So you don't know what they look like. You don't know what an Amalekite looks like. Now, if the latter is the case, there are cunning people who crave power, which means that if they are scattered, remember Haman worked his way up to a high-ranking position under the king, they're probably intelligent people, but they still have that inbred thought of destroy Israel. So they could have, if they are scattered among the nations, be some of the top leaders in some of these nations around the world. Some of them we may be even negotiating with today. It's possible. Many of them may have climbed political hierarchy to positions of power and are likely the leaders of today's nation states. Although controversy remains with regards to who exactly today's Amalekites are, there's one thing we can agree on, that aggressive Muslim entities sure act like them. They attack the weak, just like they did when they came out of Egypt. So, what does the Bible say about this? Does it have any impact on us? Is it affecting our world? Not right now. We're still pretty much living our lives the way they always have been. But what's happening behind the scenes, what's happening in Europe, what's happening in the negotiations, what's happening in our fundamental change of America, we're beginning to see a change. And sooner or later, it's going to affect us in this day and age. Well, let's notice a prophecy in the book of Psalms. A prophecy, and when I looked this up, it says that no other time in history has this ever taken place. Psalm 83. Notice what it says. Keep not your silence in verse 1, O God. Hold not your peace. and be not still, O God. For lo, your enemies make a tumult, and they that hate you have lifted up the head. In other words, they're beginning to manifest themselves. They're beginning to take action. They have taken crafty counsel against your people. Who's his people? Israel and America. And consulted against your hidden ones. The footnotes that I read, that's Christianity. So they're consulting against Christians. They have said, come, let us cut them off from being a nation. Is that not what Iran wants to do? Destroy Israel from the face of the earth? They won't recognize them as human beings. They won't recognize them as a people. Will not do it. And they're not going to do it. Does that fit the profile of the Amalekites? Let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more. No more in remembrance. For they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against you in an alliance. And these nations, just like they did in ancient Israel, begin to unite with each other to destroy Israel. Iran right now is the primary leader in terrorism. They're supporting it. Now, once we lift the sanctions and the money starts pouring in for the oil, they're going to be, as a nation, become very productive. And they're going to be able to spend a lot more money and spread it out to buy more weapons and cause terrorism to increase. And they're doing it in all the various nations around the Middle East. Iran is the leader of this terrorism plot. They support Al-Qaeda. They support ISIS. And yet we're negotiating with them. The tabernacles of Edom and the Ishmaelites, the Arabs, the Muslims, and the Hagarenes, Gebal and Ammon, that's Jordan, and Amalek, there they are. The Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre, and Asher also is joined with them. Asher is Germany. So is Germany going to enter into some type of agreement with this conglomeration of nations that's manifesting themselves in the Middle East? It's possible. It's possible that they could because of the oil. But when we look at Daniel 11th chapter, in Daniel 11, we see a prophecy about the European Union, or that seventh resurrected head, growing and growing in power. Now we know that the seventh resurrection of that head is going to be the European Union, the final resurrection of the Holy Roman Empire. So they're going to grow in power, and something's going to cause them to unite. And he says there'll be 10 nations that throw in their power with them. They're known as the King of the North in Bible prophecy. Now when we come to 11, it says, verse 39, thus shall he do in the most strongholds with a strange God, whom he shall acknowledge and increase with glory, and shall cause them to rule over many, and shall divide the land for gain. And the time of the end shall the king of the south. Now this must be that confederation of nations we read about in Psalm 83. These nations that have joined together, and no doubt Iran is going to be the leader of that. I suspect they will. Now, it's possible to change. But the king of the south, is going to push at the king of the north. And I don't know how. Whether they'll be cut them off from oil, or they're never going to be satisfied. They may unite with the Europeans for a while, but then they will want that land as well. So something's going to happen that's going to be a split. The king of the south will push at the king of the north, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen. Blitzkrieg. They're going to be a powerful nation, just like Germany was in World War II. They're coming again with more modern and sophisticated weapons. And it says they're going to come in verse 41, into the glorious land. That's in Israel. And many countries shall be overthrown. That's the Middle East. But these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom and Moab and the chief of children of Ammon. Maybe they're honoring the treaty agreements, and they're not going to attack them. He shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures and of gold and silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. His war is going to break out in the Middle East. But tidings out of the east and out of the north, Russia, China, Japan, shall trouble him. Therefore shall go forth with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. And we see that ultimately he comes to an end. Now, it's a shame that people have gotten away from the Bible, because the Bible tells us what's going to happen in the last days. But people are oblivious to that. They still want to have their parties. They still want to have their yachts. They still want to have their fun. As a result of that, they don't listen to the Bible anymore. It's just a fable. It's just something that people talk about. But there's no relevance. It's not anything that we need to pay attention to, or is it? Well, God's people will pay attention. Because from the day that God created man in the Garden of Eden till now, the Bible has spelled out man's past and definitely his future. Now let's conclude by Numbers 24. It's evident that mankind was not capable of blotting out the Amalekites. They just couldn't do it. They just wouldn't do it when Saul let them get away. But then God, through the prophet Balaam, begins to give us the end-time prophecy. So we notice in Numbers 24, verse 14, "And now behold, I go unto my people. Come therefore, and I will advertise thee what this people shall do to your people in the latter days." This is a prophecy. "And he took up his parable and said, Balaam, the son of Beor, has said, and the man whose eyes are open has said, he has said, which heard the words of God and knew the knowledge of the Most High, which saw the vision of the Almighty, falling into a trance, but having his eyes open, I shall see him, but not now. I shall behold him, but not nigh. There shall come a star out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel, and shall smite the corners of Moab, and destroy all the children of Sheth." This is talking about Christ's return. "And Edom shall be a possession. Seir also shall be a possession for his enemies, and Israel shall do valiantly. Out of Jacob shall come he that shall have dominion, and shall destroy him that remains of the city. And when he looked on Amalek, he took up his parable and said, Amalek was the first of the nations. He was the first to attack Israel, but his latter end shall be that he shall perish forever." So God says that those Amalekites are going to be around from generation to generation, but when he does return, he will destroy those Amalekites, possibly raise them up during the white throne judgment. But we won't, during the millennium, remember those Amalekites anymore.